welcome to this episode of The Council. I'm your host, David Dean, coming to you here from the Gay Life Television studio in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'd like everyone to remember that we now have The Council Facebook page up, so come and like us. We just got over 100 likes, which is our first milestone. And you can also follow us on Twitter at GLTV The Council. On tonight's episode with me, I have Colin Dean, who has a bachelor's degree in computer science from Westminster College and a master's degree in education from Robert Morris University. Colin was at one time one of the top 5 over-the-counter Bitcoin traders in the United States on local Bitcoin. And he's going to be sharing a little bit more with us about Bitcoin and what its future directions may be and how that could be impacting us right here in Pittsburgh right after this. Welcome back. I'm here with Colin Dean, who is a Bitcoin trader on local Bitcoin. Colin, could you please tell me a little bit more about yourself and how you initially got into Bitcoin?
So I'm a software developer by trade, both vocationally and avocationally. I've been developing software for better part of 15 years. My initial interest in Bitcoin came primarily because of the cryptography aspect of it, being that it is what we call a digital cryptocurrency. Right. Digital meaning that it's really represented in a string of ones and zeros. Crypto meaning that it is having to do with cryptography, here secured by cryptography. And currency, it's a form of money. My initial interest at first was entirely selfish. This kind of idea that you could run a program on your computer and make money. Whether or not that money was worth anything at the time was kind of irrelevant. It was just the idea that I could run a program, help out a network, and possibly benefit financially from it.
So at that time, it was a little bit of a gamble, but a cheap or free gamble that was kind of for funsies.
Yeah, exactly. I had no idea what the result was going to be, if anything that I was generating would eventually be worth something someday. But obviously it has been. It's considered worth a lot now.
Right.
And sometimes I wish I still had those coins that I had back in those days. As time has gone on, my interest has gone from a technical or one of financial gain to one of a greater mission, understanding what benefits Bitcoin may have to the current economy, to our current monetary system, what problems it addresses, what things it makes more efficient, what things it makes redundant.
Right.
And spreading not only an understanding of how it works, but how it can be used, how it can interface with the existing, what we sometimes call the legacy money system, the
right.
fiat system, and improving relations in those regards.
All right. So would you mind kind of giving sort of a brief, simplified breakdown for our viewers of exactly how does Bitcoin work? Like, we'll start with, I understand that it was invented around 2009, and the programmer that invented it was kind of anonymous. Basically, there's sort of a pen name sort of used, but no one knows if it was an individual or group, but it came into existence in 2009. And I understand it's based on a series of algorithms, and you can take it from there because you explain that part better than I do.
Right. So there are two main key points of Bitcoin. There's this notion of mining and transacting. Mining is really processing transactions in a way. That's a good summarization of it. Mining is the process of continuously calculating a certain algorithm, performing a very complex math equation to look for a a string of characters that is a certain value, or is really above a certain number.
Right.
That number is what we call difficulty. That difficulty gets harder as time goes on. So miners have to work longer in order to get over that number.
In my understanding, it's not just a consequence of time, but it's also a consequence of how many people are mining and kind of the collective effort going into mining.
Yes, and luck,
adjusted. Yeah.
and purely luck. There's a website called blockchain.info that keeps very close tabs on the mechanics of the Bitcoin network, and they have a category called miner luck. It's simply like, how lucky can you be at finding these blocks, because it's quite literally your computer picking a random number and running this calculation on it until the output of that calculation exceeds the difficulty. Beyond that, mining takes transactions as they come in and validates them. Make sure that nobody's trying to spend more money than they have. Trying to make sure that nobody is claiming to own more money than they have.
And so that's how it becomes a secure and, in a sense, regulated currency, where
Correct.
it's not centrally regulated, but everyone who's running this program on their computer is sharing the same data. And so as new data comes in, they can all sort of check it with one another and make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. You could kind of think of it as a way of going and buying something in a store, and instead of when you swipe your credit card, the device has to go out to your bank and make sure that you have enough money in your bank account before allowing the...
And it's the bank and the bank alone which says
Right.
yay or nay.
This, in Bitcoin, it's anybody. You know, the guy standing behind me can verify that I have enough money, you know, if he were to know which account is mine. The merchant can find out immediately if I'm able to pay. And for merchants, that's a big thing. You don't want to have a transaction fail because somebody doesn't have enough money and you've already given them their item.
Right.
Mining also facilitates the introduction of more currency into the system. This happens at a declining rate. Initially, it starts at about 50 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. You know, we call that the block reward. It used to be 50 Bitcoins. Now it's 25 Bitcoins. It will continue to have every 210,000 blocks. This works out to about every 4 years. Difficulty gets harder about every 2 weeks or so. It's not exactly every 2 weeks, because lately miners have been processing faster than the original calculations.
And so all of those factors go into affecting
Right.
things. My understanding, however, though, is because of everything's incremental adjustment, it essentially continues to sort of slow itself back into the planned pace.
Yes, that's the exact point of difficulty adjustments, is to try to keep a new block found every 10 minutes. Right now, as of less than half an hour ago, we were finding a new block about every 7.25 minutes. That's fast.
Right.
But the difficulty adjustment that's coming probably sometime in the next 24 hours will account for that. This is not to say that it will take it back to 10 minutes. It will probably take it to 10 minutes for a couple of hours. But that time period will slowly skew closer to 1, or really approach 1 as time goes on, if the current pace of additional mining power. When we talk about mining power, we talk about number of calculations per second.
Right.
This hash rate has more than doubled in the past, I think it was the past couple of weeks, maybe the past month or so.
Right.
The difficulty level itself has quadrupled in the past about 6 weeks.
And let me just briefly, I'll break that down for the viewers. When we talk about a hash, that's the output from the computer applying this algorithm to data. And so when we talk about hash rate, computers are processing, anywhere from millions of hashes per second up into billions and trillions of hashes per second. And now, of course, we're trying to develop technology to really expand on that and push the limits of how many of these calculations can be computed per per second, and that's what's being applied towards mining. I will say that it took a consultation with him, another tech expert, and a flowchart for me to come to my rudimentary understanding of this. So that's why I hope that we can kind of make some of this translate on the show to our viewers that don't come from a tech background. Right now, we have to go to a brief commercial break, but we'll be back with more Bitcoin after this. Welcome back to the council. We're still here with Colin Dean, who's talking to us a little bit about Bitcoin. We just reviewed some of the principles of how mining occurs. We're talking about difficulty, hash rate. You were discussing difficulty going up sort of in proportion to the hash rate being applied to mining.
Right. This is to ensure that the flow of money over time decreases. It may increase a little bit over short periods of time, over a smaller average, day average, maybe even a week average. But over the grand scheme of things, it will eventually approach zero, or at least the block reward will approach zero. And after, I think it's 32 halvings, will go away entirely. Halving occurs approximately every 4 years. The last one occurred about 2 months, no, it was about a month early. The next one is projected to occur approximately 3 months early, but this is also, this projection was, hasn't yet necessarily taken into account the massive jump in hashing power that has entered the network in the past couple of months.
And so really those differences in time are big within the parameters of the projection and everything that's going on, but essentially in the grand scheme of things, kind of small and suggesting those are pretty good projections.
Right, exactly. On to the next part of Bitcoin, or really one last kind of final note on mining. Mining is something that used to be something that anybody can get into, and really technically anybody can get into it now. But in order to run that computer program that generates you money, you have to have a pretty serious computer, and we're talking very specialized processor cores called ASICs. Some older devices are still able to keep up, but they're nowhere near as profitable as they once were.
Right.
My mining rig a year ago was making me about a Bitcoin a month, and now I'm lucky if I would see a Bitcoin in 10 years. Right. So. Transactions are really what the population is wanting to get into, wanting to see. That's where things happen. Mining just says this transaction is good, and mining helps kind of the economics of it. But transaction, that's where the money is actually going from person to person.
Right.
A transaction contains a set of addresses, really an input address and an output address. So that's like saying I'm address A. I want to send 10 Bitcoins to address B.
And right now that's about $2,200 US, so thank you.
Yeah, that's a lot of money. It's not all of the, people think, oh God, that's a lot of money. Well, Bitcoin has 21 million Bitcoins will eventually enter the system.
Yeah, so when all that halving finishes off, we'll be at 21 million is kind of the end product, and the idea there is to limit the amount of inflation that can happen with it. Granted, right now, as we've gone along the way, Bitcoins used to be nearly worthless, and a Bitcoin would have been like a fraction of a cent, and to now where a Bitcoin is trading currently around $220 US per Bitcoin, but there's still, compared to other things we may consider commodities as far as US dollars go, there's still quite a bit of fluctuation. However, it has held at around the 200 mark for at least a couple months now.
Kind of. It's been in the past couple of weeks. It's gone. It fluctuated a bit. It's been on a general upturn. We're getting pretty close to where it topped out back in April. I believe that the top was somewhere in the 240s. I wouldn't be surprised if we see that in the next 2 or 3 days. You could speculate a lot about the price. People have made a lot of money and lost a lot of money speculating on Bitcoin price. But ultimately, that's not something that I see the end user doing. I don't really want to see too many people treating Bitcoin as a security. I'd rather see them treat it as a means of value exchange, which is
Right.
really what transactions are.
Yes.
To the thought, oh, well, there's only 21 million Bitcoin going through circulation at any point. There's actually not 21 million units. It's actually 21 quadrillion units because each Bitcoin is divisible down 8 places. So to map this to to the current economy, there's something like $75 trillion available in what's called M3, which is, for all intents and purposes, the total money supply of the entire world. And map that on 2.1 quadrillion, 75 trillion, you can do the math and figure that there's a lot of money per individual unit that can go around. Will there be a day when somebody owns a millibitcoin? Sure. Even down even lower, picobitcoins? Sure. There's even names for those. We call the smallest unit is called a Satoshi in honor of Satoshi Nakamoto, the person who founded Bitcoin and developed it and released it.
The alleged person.
Yes. Nobody really knows who he is. Not even Gavin Anderson knows who he is. And when we say he, it could be a she, it could be a they.
Right.
We don't know. And ultimately, it can be argued that it doesn't matter. We know that Satoshi has, or it's very likely that Satoshi has in his own possession somewhere around 300,000 Bitcoins, but we can't prove it. Nobody can prove it.
Right.
Other than early transactions, early mining rewards. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter. At least in my mind, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Back onto transactions, how transactions work. I can pull out my phone and say, I can carry X number of Bitcoins on my phone.
Right.
And when I want to send a Bitcoin to you, I get your address somehow. Whether I type it in, and that's kind of long and onerous, it's 34, 35 characters. Generally, I'm going to scan it, either using the NFC on the back of newer phones, or I'm going to scan it using the camera, use a QR code. That gets me your address. I punch in the amount that I want to send you, I hit send. At the moment that I hit send, you can think of it as a transaction. I'm signing a note that says, this address sends this address this amount. I sign it just as if I were signing a contract, and it magically appears to you. What's happening behind the scenes is that my phone is sending that transaction to a whole bunch of other phones and computers and servers all over the internet that are listening for Bitcoin transactions to come through.
So that big set of data that everyone using Bitcoin is sharing essentially has that information now programmed into it. So where everyone's on the same page, it can be verified.
Exactly. It's called the blockchain.
Right.
Because it's literally a chain of these blocks that we were talking about when we were talking about mining, where each block references the previous block. And that's a way of keeping things secure such that nobody can go back and change history without having to calculate a lot of data.
Essentially, if someone tried to change the information involved in a single or particular transaction, they not only would have to go back and change that transaction, but everything that happens instantaneously as we're doing that. There's dozens, hundreds, thousands, millions of other people doing Bitcoin transactions in that moment and the moments after that. They would have to go back and sort of reconstruct all of the data that followed that, which is nearly impossible.
Yeah, it's mathematically improbable, astronomically improbable. You could probably, at the current depth, heat death is something to talk about, heat death of the universe, but it's still, it would take more money than it's worth to do it.
Right. So that's how Bitcoin is kept secure. I do want to talk a little bit about the ways in which Bitcoin could really become useful and have utility, in our society and really all across the world. And so to do that, I need to explain a little bit about the informal economy, but an economist could do that better than I could. And so I have a video clip of a TED Talk given by Robert Neuwirth. And so we'll show that to you, and I'm going to let Robert Neuwirth kind of give a good definition of the informal economy for you so we can bring that back to how Bitcoin may apply to it.
Okay, and we'll be back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
All right, so what he basically explained there was that in many parts of the world, you have sort of unregulated commerce going on. And I think that, as he points out, we typically think of that as a bad thing. It's the black market. We assume, oh, there must be terrible things going on there. And that's not necessarily the case, because what he's showing you are just kind of these very public markets. It's not a seedy, shady place. It's where people are going and buying their groceries and everyday things that they use and making a living in otherwise difficult places to live. And so Bitcoin could have an enormous utility in a place like that. And I think that places like Africa and other places that have enormous informal economies are places that Bitcoin is really going to take off because, for one thing, it's not centralized. And so it's not running through a bank. Because in an area with an informal economy in a developing country, many of those people don't have bank accounts, but they have cell phones.
Correct. There's a system in parts of Africa called M-Pesa. M-Pesa is a very good thing for those areas, and I would love to see something like that as a competitor to some of the things that we have here in the United States. M-Pesa operates through the exchange of cellular airtime, and as well as paying for things with cellular airtime. So not only would I pay you back for lunch or pay you for some loaves of bread with nothing but a text message, you could pay your bills with it, you could go buy another phone with it, you could do anything you want. Bitcoin is really not a whole lot different from M-Pesa, except that there's nobody in control of it.
Right.
M-Pesa is still under some governmental oversight. It's still trackable, it's still subpoenaable, assuming that the countries where it's used are willing to do that kind of information, and
Right.
I'm sure that they are.
Because M-Pesa is regulated by, there's some corporations that have stake in it, and the cell phone companies are regulating it and working with it. But it was kind of born out of necessity, where it was just observed that in many of these areas, people were using cellular airtime as a proxy for money. And so they were kind of like, well, let's go with that and, see what we can do with it. Granted, that brings you back to the idea, though, that it is or can be centrally regulated. And so there kind of then becomes sort of the power dynamic that we see in all forms of regulated currency, where the transaction fees are kind of set for people, and it's not democratic in, we're all just making sure we're on the same page, but you have a central authority telling you either yes, you have the funds, or no, you don't, and I'm in control of them.
And worse, that central authority can take your funds away without due process, without cause, without anything. Just say, we think you're doing something wrong. We're going to put a freeze on your assets. You can't do anything. Bitcoin rejects that entirely.
Right.
There's nobody who has control of your balance in Bitcoin other than you, or the people that you have surrendered a little bit of that security in order to gain some convenience.
And I think that's what scares particularly governments about Bitcoin is, here's this thing that we're not directly in control of.
Right.
I'd like to think that no one would take money out of my bank account without due process, but then we signed the Patriot Act, so I can't say that I necessarily feel that way anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it happens. Think of a charity. A really good case of this is PayPal, and the number of times that PayPal has frozen charity accounts because that charity maybe had neglected to read PayPal's terms of service that don't allow unregistered charities to accept donations, or maybe some product, some company develops product that they really want to sell, and they decide to offer it for pre-order on PayPal. You can't do that with PayPal. Do anything fishy with PayPal, PayPal pulls out the rug from underneath you and will hold on to your balance until 180 days or longer, or maybe lawyers have to get involved, and that's expensive.
In a similar turn of events, however, PayPal faced regulatory scrutiny in nearly all 50 states when it first came out, where it was like, oh, what's this rogue system of financial transfer going to be? And now it's kind of the gold standard for paying for things online.
Exactly. And as it has grown, it has gotten to the point that it has government influence in it. It has corporate interests in it. It has private interests of stockholders. A group of people who their only job is to make money.
Right.
And that's really what a company do. A company is meant to make money for its shareholders, whether that shareholder is the owner or
Whereas with
people.
Bitcoin, regulating is sort of a function of using it.
Right. You could kind of think of it as self-regulating. Because there's no central authority to say, oh, you're not allowed to send money to this person because of reason X. Bitcoin doesn't care about that. Sure, there are still legal ways in there. There's still, the government could say, oh, you sent money to there, that was illegal, blah, 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 blah. But the government can't stop that. The government couldn't even technically track it if you used Bitcoin correctly.
Speaking of the government getting involved with Bitcoin, in the limited time we have left today, I do want to mention Silk Road.
Yes. Silk Road was an online marketplace for narcotics. The founder of which was recently arrested.
It wasn't necessarily meant to be that. It's just what it became.
Yeah, yeah.
It was the street corner of the internet.
Kind of, yeah. A very interesting thing that came out of this was when the FBI got his bitcoins, which it's kind of a nebulous definition of they got his bitcoins, because to our knowledge, to kind of the public knowledge, they really only got an encrypted file that has his signature in it.
Which would be his Bitcoin wallet, which everyone could have, and that
Right.
you would have private access to. And the last thing I read is the FBI's best computer people cannot crack his Bitcoin wallet to actually have access to seize the Bitcoins. The biggest part of this, though, is this case. In order for them to prosecute it, they're kind of being forced. The government's being forced to recognize that Bitcoin's money.
Exactly, and that's a big thing. One thing that's really weird about this is that if, on the unlikely occurrence that they were to get into his wallet, this would be the first time that a government has seized several $1 million, and the populace could actually see exactly where that money goes whenever it's seized. Bitcoin is wonderful for transparency in that regard. I mean, imagine if we paid our taxes, imagine if we paid everything to the government with Bitcoin. Then the populace could actually see every single transaction, where every dime, every Satoshi goes for the government's entire operations. That's unprecedented transparency.
Right. Just as well, it's kind of like, with the government now recognizing that Bitcoin's money, one thing that was advantageous prior to that recognition is, now it operates outside of formal financial regulations that any other form of currency needs to. But it's also advantageous that now it's kind of being forced to fall through the cracks of the regulations, to have the regulations applied to it. So even though it's regulated similar to money, it's still not sort of a centrally owned currency like anything else in the world, correct? And now people are looking at it in terms of like Forex trading. So people, a lot of big time investors are now looking at, well, let's buy, trade, hold Bitcoin as if it was euros or Canadian dollars or something else we could speculatively make money off
Right.
of.
There's the notorious Winklevi twins, the Winklevosses of Facebook fame. They have started up a hedge fund, or in the process of starting up a hedge fund related to Bitcoin speculation and holding. There's another one, the name of which is escaping me at the moment, and there's even another one that somebody I know is planning to start within the year, and it'll be exciting to see where that goes. Again, it gets into the kind of speculation that investors would want to be interested in. It's always good to diversify investments, and
Right.
I would advocate as someone who was an armchair investor that Bitcoin is a good place to stick 1 or 2% and forget about it.
Right.
Because it could be worth nothing. It could be worth millions per coin in the future. There was a chart floating around the internet a couple of days ago that made a pretty good case for Bitcoin being $1 million a coin within about 30 years.
Well, if you map it, it goes back to that mapping it to the existent currency and becoming equivalent to it. That's where the sort of denomination of it would.
Right. Will that happen? I don't know. It's speculation, and I mean a lot of this is speculation.
Right.
But I would love to see it.
And we are out of time for tonight. Thank you for joining us on the council. Remember, you can catch us here on Gay Life Television as you view us on Roku, Justin.tv, MondoClub.com, and you can look for us on your Samsung Smart TV. Hope to see you all back soon.